I would like to start by introducing Gene Baur. He's the founder and president of Farm Sanctuary in Watkins Glen, New York, and there's also one in California. Gene has been hailed as the conscience of the food movement by Time magazine. Since the mid-1980s, he has traveled extensively, campaigning to raise awareness about the abuses of industrialized factory farming and our system of cheap food production. He has done undercover investigations and exposed factory farm cruelties. His list of stellar accomplishments includes 2 bestsellers, testifying in courts for better conditions for farm animals, and inspiring an international farm sanctuary movement, among many others. Thank you so much, Gene.
My pleasure to be here. And your words, by the way, what you were speaking about in terms of our relationships with other animals in EO, beautiful. So I just wanted to say thank you for that and for sharing that with everybody here.
Our other speaker in the conversation is Donny Moss. Donny Moss is a multi-talented and accomplished animal rights campaigner, advocate, protest organizer, documentarian, videographer, founder and publisher of a weekly online animal rights publication in TheirTurn.net. And it has revealing things every week that you should really tune into.
How did you get your start? What is your journey? You were at this long before most anybody else. What happened?
Well, I grew up and saw a lot of violence and harm around me in the world. I didn't want to be a cog in the wheel. Didn't want to just follow along and do what I'm supposed to do. Because I saw, wild animals being harmed. I saw animals hit by cars. I grew up in Los Angeles. I saw big, beautiful trees cut down. I was hearing about war and violence. I thought, why are we doing this? So I started getting involved with environmental groups, social justice groups, and I learned about factory farming and just how harmful it was. My first vision was my grandmother told me how veal calves are raised. I said, I'm never eating veal. This is the 1970s. In the 1980s, I hitchhiked around the country, started getting involved with a bunch of different activist groups, learning more about the cruelty of factory farming, learning about the inefficiency of animal agriculture. I heard about Diet for a Small Planet, Francis LePay's book about how we could feed more people with less land through plant-based agriculture. And then in 1985, I went vegan, and in 1986, co-founded Farm Sanctuary. And I felt that if we're going to work on these issues, we need to see firsthand what is happening. So we started investigating and going in to document conditions, and taking pictures. And our sort of simple thinking at the time was that if people are humane, people don't want to support this. If people see these pictures, they're going to go vegan. Right, it's a lot more complicated than that. We grow up in social systems, belief systems. We're influenced very much by our social environment. So it's a lot more complicated. But in doing these investigations, we would find living animals thrown in trash cans, and we started rescuing them. We found living animals left discarded on piles of dead animals. We started rescuing them. And so this is how the rescue work began. And at the time, we were living in a row house in Wilmington, Delaware. We funded the organization by selling vegan hot dogs at Grateful Dead shows out of our Volkswagen van. And so we couldn't rescue a whole lot of animals. But then a farmer had a little space, and so he let us use 3 acres on this tofu farm in Pennsylvania. We lived in the school bus on the tofu farm for a couple of years. And then in 1989, we got the farm in Watkins Glen. It started out as 175 acres. We now have over 300 acres there. And we have a farm also near Los Angeles, and these are sanctuaries for animals. So we started by rescuing animals from cruelty. We recognized when we were in Wilmington, Delaware, like the kids in the neighborhood would come by and were very curious about turkeys? What are they? And pigs, and so it was clear that these animals were ambassadors, and when people could connect with them, they could see them as something other than, most people have never met a living turkey. and they don't know that they're very outgoing and friendly and curious. And people visit the sanctuaries, and so often they're really struck by turkeys, how they follow us around. And I think one of the reasons is that when humans abuse other animals, or when humans abuse other people for that matter, there's a tendency for the powerful folks in the position of being able to exploit and abuse others to denigrate the victims of the abuse. This is sort of, I think, an unhealthy, but a pattern. So in the case of turkeys, they've been so denigrated. And, being called a turkey, for example, is not a compliment, right? So I think there's, in people's minds, this notion that turkeys have all these negative qualities, which are untrue. And so people come and visit the sanctuary, and turkeys follow them around. And it's like, wow, they're kind of like my dog. I didn't know they were like that. And so the sanctuary provides this opportunity for people to get to know individual animals. And so in addition to rescuing animals, we educate, and we're advocating for systemic reforms. We've been able to pass some laws to ban some of the worst cruelties, including the confining of animals in cages and crates where they can't even turn around. We started this in the early 2000s, usually through voter initiatives, because when you would get a bill introduced in a state legislature or in Washington, D.C., it would go to the Agriculture Committee, made up of lawmakers very friendly to agribusiness. And these bills died year after year after year. In 2000, we got a measure on the ballot in Florida. Actually, in 2002 is when it was voted on. And Floridians, for the first time in this country, anywhere, voted to outlaw a confinement system, gestation crates for breeding pigs, 2-foot wide metal enclosures. So that was the first such law. And since then, about a dozen or so have passed. And just this last week, so these are basic reforms, right? Give animals space to turn around, ban these confinement systems where they, in cages barely larger than their bodies. But the industry thinks that's too much, and they've been challenging this. They've been in court, and in fact, the Supreme Court heard a case just a couple of days ago where the industry is trying to undermine California's law that outlaws this confinement and outlaws the sale of products from factory farmed animals in the state of California. So that got agribusiness around the country very upset, because California is a big market, and if they can't sell factory farmed products there, they're worried they're going to lose profits, obviously. So they've been in court fighting the state of California for years, losing each time, but recently the Supreme Court agreed to hear the case, and the oral arguments were
Tuesday.
Yeah, so very recent, and so this is an ongoing battle, and it boils down to what is appropriate for human beings. How should we interact with other animals, and can we live with others in peace and with kindness, or do we need to continue abusing and extracting? So in simple terms, I see this is all about relationships. What are our relationships with other animals, or other people, or the earth for that matter? Are these relationships based on mutuality, where both parties at the end of the day come out in a better position? Or are these relationships about extraction or taking? And in the case of farm animals, it's all about extraction. And so, is that okay? That is the fundamental question. And it's something we all have to think about personally, but I'm a vegan activist, and by the way, for those that are not vegan, I'm not here to judge, and I appreciate being able to speak here about these issues. But each of us are on our own journeys. We take the steps we think make sense, and each of us, does what we think is best. And part of my job, I think, is just to talk about what happens, and so people can make informed choices about what they decide to eat.
Yeah, thank you. And what they decide to eat is a lot different today. Actually, the options that we have available to us today are a lot different. So I went vegan in 2005 because I stumbled upon a vegetarian festival in my neighborhood, and I saw they were giving out free samples, and I love those. And so I walked in and got my free samples, and I walked out with a DVD called Meet Your Meat about factory farms. And here I was, someone who sat down to eat 3 times a day, and I had no idea where my food came from. And I put this DVD in my computer at the time and watched this DVD, and I shut my computer and I decided I was going to go vegan. But this was in 2005. It was a different time. We didn't have we didn't have substitutes for all of the things. So how is it different for you 30 something years ago to today?
Oh, it's amazing. You go to a grocery store, there's all kinds of alternatives to cow's milk now, right? Which is beautiful. Back in like 1985, we got soy powder, mixed it with water with a whisk to make soy milk, so it's very different today than it was. You can even get an Impossible Whopper at Burger King, a veggie burger. That was not the case back then. So it's a lot easier. But I would also say that, vegan food has been with us forever. I mean, think about Ethiopian food, Indian food. Most ethnic foods tend to be primarily plant-based because eating plants is more efficient than raising animals for food. In the US alone, 10 times more land is used for animal agriculture versus plant-based. So if we shifted towards plant-based, we could let a lot more wildlife have their space. Right now we're cutting down the rainforests to graze animals and actually to raise soybeans to feed farm animals. I mean, this is just extraordinarily inefficient and harmful, not only to the animals, but to the earth. UN came out with a report a number of years ago called Livestock's Long Shadow, talking about how animal agriculture is one of the top contributors to the most significant environmental problems we face, including the loss of biodiversity, including the climate issues. Animal agriculture contributes more to climate issues than the entire transportation industry, according to the UN. So we also, another quick statistic just to kind of give a sense of how the size of the footprint of animal agriculture. There was a survey done a couple of years ago looking at life on Earth. And when they looked at mammals, of the mammals living on Earth, only 4% are living in the wild. 96% are either humans or domesticated, mainly farm animals. And so we're losing biodiversity. We're factory farming in these monoculture, crops and then genetically engineered animals. And we're using enormous amounts of resources, which are then harming wildlife. So anyway, the consequences of this industry are massive, and it's something that most of us grow up not thinking about. I grew up eating meat like everybody around me. I grew up in Hollywood, California. As a kid, I did commercials for places like McDonald's without really thinking about it. And so as time goes though, and as I started learning, I decided I didn't want to be part of causing this unnecessary harm. So, but again, each of us, has our own process, and ultimately we each need to make our own choices. But I think it's important to be aware of the consequences of our choices, and not only to animals in the earth, but also to ourselves. It's been estimated in our country that we could save 70% on healthcare costs by shifting to a healthier, whole food, plant-based diet. No, I'm not a full whole food plant-based, I'm a vegan, but some of what I eat is processed. That's not the healthiest. But, eating that way, we could literally save billions of dollars on healthcare costs. And here's another thing about the healthcare industry and pharmaceuticals. The majority of the antibiotics produced in the US are fed to farm animals. So we have diseased animals, mass-produced in factory farms, being fed tons and tons of antibiotics. We eat these animal products, we get sick, and then of course there's antibiotic resistance as well as a result of this. But we eat food that makes us sick, and then we take these we need medical interventions. And so anyway, we can do an awful lot to live better, to live in a way that causes less harm to other animals, the earth, and ourselves. And then there's workers. There's so many issues here. I'll sort of hold back because I can go too far. So anyway,
you talk about being a child and eating meat, as probably most of us did, and you just didn't know. None of us knew. The author Jonathan Safran Foer, who wrote Everything That Was Illuminated, one of his next books was called Eating Animals. Has anybody ever heard of this book, Eating Animals? A few people. Really, really good book, a quick read if you're interested in learning more on the subject of eating animals. And I remember him talking about how when he had kids, he wanted to learn about where the food that he was feeding his kids came from. So he contacted Tropicana, and they agreed to give him a tour of the orange grove and similar fruits and vegetables. But as soon as he tried to get a tour of a farm where animals were raised, he was turned away everywhere. And so, Gene, why is that? Why is it that we know so little And then there's ag-gag laws, so maybe you could speak a little bit about that.
Yeah, no, agribusinesses don't want people seeing this. They don't want people talking about this. And as you say, they've passed these ag-gag laws across the country, making it illegal to investigate and have public discussions about what happens to animals in factory farms. Even before many of the ag-gag laws were passed, Oprah Winfrey talked about how they're feeding dead cows to living cows. She had a former rancher turned activist, Howard Lyman, on her show, and they talked about this, and Oprah said, "You just stopped me from eating another burger," and the beef industry sued her from Texas. So she had to go down to Texas to defend herself, and that's where she met Dr. Phil, because they were doing the jury selection stuff. But even somebody like Oprah, with the platform she has been much more careful about the way she discusses these things. So they're very litigious, and there is a chilling effect on the part of media, unfortunately. So that's one reason that we don't hear about this. And now I was on Larry King Live back in like the early 90s, and I remember the industry's lawyers were very involved talking to CNN saying, if you do this, you might get sued. And I was there, I debated a meat industry guy, and Larry King said, "We're gonna have these guys back, we've just touched the surface," and we never came back. So there is a very conscious, active effort to prevent these issues from being discussed openly. And also, what is happening now, it's been very good to see laws being passed to ban certain confinement systems. As I mentioned, a number of states now outlaw putting animals in cages where they can't even turn around. Most of the industry states still allow it. But some businesses are now starting to market things as cage-free, free range, free roaming. That's good and bad. The good part is that there's an awareness that consumers care and don't want animals to suffer. The bad part is that most of these labels tend to sound a lot better than they are. And if you label something as cage-free or whatever, you can charge a lot more for it. So it's actually profitable. So the economic incentive is to make things sound better than they are. And that is what is happening. So things are moving in some ways in a positive direction, but there's also a lot of greenwashing happening now.
Just quickly, are there regulations against that? And does pasture-fed mean anything at all? Is it regulated?
This is not adequately regulated. There is not an adequate infrastructure in place to police it if there were legitimate regulations. And pasture raised is usually not accurate either. So, and there's different industries operate very differently. The beef industry is one of the least consolidated, at least in the early part of the production system. Most cows that are killed for slaughter, and of course dairy cows have had it really bad and then they go to slaughter, but most cattle raised specifically for beef start on a cow-calf operation, where the cow has a calf and they are actually outdoors grazing for the first part of their life. So that's technically grass-fed, and they'll use the term grass-fed, and then they'll put them in a feedlot.
Yeah.
So unless it says grass-finished, it's typical beef. And even if it says grass-finished, it's probably not as good as it sounds.
The film that won last year, Cow, was all about that. It is the most heartbreaking thing you've ever seen in your whole life, which won your award last year, right, Zelda? I do want to remind everyone, the food here today is all vegan.
Yay! That's it. Vegan food. Love it, love it.
And thank you to Antonella at the Baker House for hosting us.
Yes, thank you.
What a beautiful venue. Thank you so much. What's that? Oh, yeah.
Oh, so I guess there are two issues with what I hear you saying. So there's the idea of animal cruelty, and then there's the idea of becoming either vegetarian or vegan because you are an environmental activist. So, and I think those two perhaps can be separated, and I only say that because there are people like yourselves who are very, very ardent, and to try and bring people over to the side of this. I think that, for example, one of my children is vegan, completely vegan, but the other lives in a community where people raise their animals sustainably on farms, that she knows where her meat comes from, they are all treated, and I think that both can coexist, and exactly what you're saying, that there aren't regulations, so perhaps they can exist together in the sense that if you are somebody who is against any animal product at any time, that's one kind of person, and if you're a person who is environmentally oriented but wants to eat meat or wants to eat eggs, then perhaps you make that choice on a way. And then there's the third part, which is being able to do that economically, because that is one of the reasons why fast food exists, is because not everyone can afford to look for food that is, right? So how do you marry those things together, I guess?
Well, first I would say that we have to all coexist, right? So, and how do we do this, right? And I also think it's okay for there to be different opinions. There needs to be different opinions. I think Benjamin Franklin said something like, if everybody thinks the same way, nobody's thinking, right? So I think it is good to have different opinions. I would say that we're not likely to see a vegan world tomorrow. And I can't control others, I can only control myself. Right? So each of us has to make our own choices. But I think, again, talking about what it means to do different things. And for some of us, it's we don't want to kill another animal if we don't have to. For some folks, they feel that eating animal products is a way to nourish themselves, sustainably and responsibly. I think that there are so many reasons, though, too. If you even care about like social justice, think about factory farms and the workers and the slaughterhouse workers. During COVID, a lot of workers in slaughterhouses were forced to go in, and the big slaughter industries were actually, not responsible for the harm that caused these people. They were actually, there's like an executive order. So there's social justice issues, environmental issues, personal health issues. And we also grow up with certain beliefs and assumptions, right? Like this belief that eating meat is healthy, we need meat for protein, right? We need to drink cow's milk for calcium, right? These are things we grow up believing that I think it's important to step back and think about critically. Think about everything critically. And I think we grow up with certain prejudices and beliefs and an infrastructure and a machinery that normalizes animal agriculture. And so sometimes as vegans, we are a little strident. And part of that is because we're very much a minority point of view, pushing back up against a system of oppression that most people are, kind of complicit in, unknowingly or unwittingly or whatever, you know what I mean? So that's part of this broader context, right, that we live in. And when you speak about how these things are affordable, right, fast food, and it is. And I do understand for many people, right, that have kids, they're running around, they got 2 jobs, and they get a fast food restaurant. That's a real challenge. It's, I would say, a systemic challenge, a system problem. The reason fast food is so cheap is because billions of dollars of government subsidies every year go into producing cheap corn and soy as animal feed, and go into supporting factory farming, and keeping prices low. So we've incented, and this belief system that eating meat and dairy is a good thing is something that's been codified in government policy, so it makes these products more accessible. And so that's a big problem. And so it is hard to change overnight for many people. But I think every little step is a positive step, and being conscientious is important, and being responsible. So if somebody's doing something themselves, that's much more responsible than somebody who's paying somebody to do something, and getting close to what is happening is, I think, admirable, and so, but again, each of us has to make our own choices. And again, I am a vegan activist, so that's what you're getting here. But, also not judgmental. Look, I don't know everything, right? I think humility is a really important part of just life. So anyway, I'm just sort of speaking for the animals here, but humility is critical, yes.